throughout my early years, I had so much exposure to kind of low-level harassment, unfortunately exposure to violence and loads of sexism. And I have really reflected on this, how those early experiences form your expectations about what's acceptable, what isn't, what you're empowered to deal with, what you're not empowered to deal with. So yeah, they all of those things had consequences for me in my early leadership approach. And in my last year of primary schooling, which in the US is called sixth grade, I agreed with my folks that I would go to the local primary school. And boy, was that a shock to the system, So for the first time in my life, I was in this highly regulated, controlled environment, having to sit at a desk all day, having to ask permission to go to the toilet, or, having to eat lunch, not when I was hungry, but at the set time. So that was a real wake-up call for me, and I didn't love it.
So when did you start to notice, either in your 20s, maybe early 30s, when some of the traits that you developed weren't particularly helping in terms of your leadership?
I had my first board level role at 27, so I was pretty raw in lots of ways. And I think quite early on, I realized maybe not everybody sees the world like I do.
Hello, and welcome to Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. In each episode of the show, we hear the insightful confessions of a successful leader who wants to inspire others to live their professional and personal dreams. I am always keen to hear your feedback, particularly in relation to the kinds of leaders you would like me to invite onto the show in future. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rich insights from our special guest.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. I'm delighted that Sue Musson has joined me in the studio today. Sue, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, we're looking forward to getting to know your story today, Sue. We always ask our guests to begin with to tell the audience a little bit about themselves and where their current focus is. So let's start there.
Okay, thank you. So the professional me is a leadership expert. I've had 30 years of experience in a whole range of non-executive and executive leadership roles in a variety of sectors. I've run a number of business services companies, and I've also started 3 of my own successful businesses under the Firecracker brand. And so after kind of establishing a really successful leadership career in the commercial environment, as a result of my son surviving a really horrible, life-threatening illness when he was 10, I took up my first non-executive role in the National Health Service in the NHS. So that led to a 15-year career as a non-executive director and chairman of 6 NHS trusts, most recently serving as the chairman of Liverpool University Hospitals, which is one of the country's largest acute hospital trusts. And I led it to be formed through a merger, led it throughout the pandemic, which was very educational, and led it to its new home, one of its new homes in the new Royal Liverpool University Hospital, which was opened by the Prince and Princess of Wales. So I've had some fun in that role. I've also served for over 10 years as a panel chair for the Judicial Appointments Commission. So I get to interview and assess candidates for judicial office across all of the tribunals and courts in the country. So that's been really interesting. And most recently, as in my professional world, I've become a best-selling author. So I've published earlier this year my first book on leadership. It's called Firecracker Leadership: How to Become a Great Leader. And I've been really delighted with the response that I've received. So I guess if I summed up the professional me, it would be very commercial leadership career paired with, I think, a deep commitment to public service and giving back. So that's about the professional me. If you want to know, we're all more than one thing, aren't we? We're all more than just our jobs. So you might have guessed from the accent that I'm both American and British. So I was born and raised in the US and have spent most of my adult life here in the UK. I'm a wife and a mother. I've been married to my lovely husband for 38 years, and we have two fantastic children. I hope I'm a good friend. I have a big network of colleagues and friends who I care about a lot. I'm a very devoted, but not very effective yogi. So I love hot yoga. And I'm also a lifelong fan of the Boston Red Sox, which takes true dedication and purpose, because all throughout my childhood, they never won anything. And that prepared me very well for also being an English cricket fan. So we're all many parts, aren't we? But that's a bit about me. And I think this last year has really brought into sharp relief for me how important it is to prioritize the non-professional you as well as the work you. In that, over this last year, I've lost a brother-in-law, my dad, and my father-in-law. And so that really hits home how important it is that you invest time, I think, in the people you care about and the people you love.
I agree. Well, thank you for that lovely summary. And we'll come back to parts of those later on as we develop through the story. Let's take you right back then, as you say, in terms of the US start, and talk to us a little bit about what kind of childhood you had and how did that shape that early leadership style that you developed in your teens and 20s?
Yeah, so I think I've thought about this. I think there are probably four main areas of experience that have shaped my early attempts at leadership. So the first one was growing up in a very loving family. I was really fortunate to be cared for and nurtured and loved by parents and siblings, who had my best interests at heart. So that was lovely. I also had quite an unusual education. So throughout my primary school years, I attended a free school, which is a school without classrooms or desks, no structure, very flexible learning environment where the teachers, all of whom we called by their first names, were kind of partners in the learning experience and were really just positioning opportunities to learn as much fun as running around outside. So everything from, learning a new musical instrument or grammar or maths or was the same as running around and collecting leaves and then working out what the different species of plants were in the area or photosynthesis, how that happened. So it was a really unique kind of experience as a student, and I thrived in that environment. I really benefited from it. But I think by the final year of my primary schooling, I'd sort of outgrown the limits of quite a small school. And we had no rules. The only rules were you had to be respectful and kind to everybody else, and also we each had a job every day, something like sweeping the porch or taking the rubbish out or tidying an area. And in my last year of primary schooling, which in the US is called sixth grade, I agreed with my folks that I would go to the local primary school. And boy, was that a shock to the system, So for the first time in my life, I was in this highly regulated, controlled environment, having to sit at a desk all day, having to ask permission to go to the toilet or, having to eat lunch, not when I was hungry, but at the set time. So that was a real wake-up call for me. And I didn't love it. I think it definitely gave me an insight into, oh boy, I'm quite a compliant soul, but petty rules, I think, are really unpleasant. So it was a shock for me. I think it was a shock for the school. They assumed I'd be very backward and were kind of surprised that I wasn't. And then I went on to, 2 years in the next stage of the state system, which was junior high school. It was pretty unremarkable and very dreary, very low expectation. And when a classmate of mine, a friend, said she was taking an entrance exam to a private school, a really selective private school, did I want to come with her? I sort of thought, I hadn't thought about that. And again, my parents were great supporters, so I passed the exam, I passed the interview, and I was offered a place. And then I went to this incredibly different private school with amazing resources, a beautiful campus, just incredible facilities, amazing libraries, very small classroom sizes, a very different style of education, lots of emphasis on arts and sports and being very well-rounded. And that was my first experience of really being in a high pressure, high competitive, high expectation environment. And again, I did thrive, but boy, there are some consequences of experiencing that kind of environment. And the only kind of career guidance or direction that we got, there was an assumption that everybody would be going on to university. And all that the guidance counselors would do was sort of say where you should pitch your expectations in your application. So I was told I should aim high and I should be attending an Ivy League university. And so I did. I got accepted at Columbia University in New York. And that's where I went for my undergraduate degree. And I took my third year here in the UK as a visiting student at York University. So yeah, I would say that educational experience was a big influence on my expectations and approach in my early leadership career. And then the other two quick things that I would point to would be the world of work. So I had a very strong work ethic anyway. I think I grew up in New England. It's a Puritan base, and I definitely adopted the Puritan work ethic. So from the age of 14, I had my first paid job at the weekend, and then all throughout my student days at high school and at university, I worked during term time. And then in the summers, I worked a number of jobs, most of them spent on Nantucket Island with my friends, in such glamorous careers like being a cleaner in a bed and breakfast and a supermarket cashier and, a range of things in New York City as well. I was a teaching assistant, but having that perspective of fitting in work, paid work alongside being a full-time student was part of my life. And yeah, I think the final big influence for me was just that throughout my education in early years, I got to encounter lots of people from different backgrounds and different cultures. My high school was half boarding and half day. And so it was very international in its complexion. When I went to university, obviously it was a very mixed campus, a huge university, very internationally based. And then, of course, I had the opportunity to come to York and experience a different culture. So, yeah, I would say those were the kind of four main influences. I took a lot of positives, I would say, into my early leadership style. So certainly surviving in those kinds of environments built a lot of self-belief and self-confidence. So I felt that was a really good positive. And I sustained, my hardworking approach and my high standards. I think that was good. And I built this sense of independence and taking personal responsibility. But along the way, I also had a lot of really difficult experiences. And I would put the negatives into perhaps two categories, like some of the less pleasant aspects and consequences of being in that very competitive, self-focused environment can, have some impact on your leadership style that's not good. And secondly, throughout my early years, I had so much exposure to kind of low-level harassment, unfortunately exposure to violence and loads of sexism. And I, have really reflected on this, how those early experiences form your expectations about what's acceptable, what isn't, what you're empowered to deal with, what you're not empowered to deal with. So yeah, they all of those things had consequences for me in my early leadership approach.
I love the richness of the early years that you had, and I was thinking, where's this going to go? And obviously, we're doing this for the first time, aren't we? And it's just lovely to hear that richness. And you had the freedom, then obviously the regimented classroom, and then this competitive side coming through. So let's just talk a little bit about, if you may, you obviously were being driven to be successful at points, and then came across these couple of areas that you were saying which were more difficult. So when did you start to notice, either in your 20s, maybe early 30s, when some of the traits that you developed weren't particularly helping in terms of your leadership?
Yeah, so I did notice them quite early on. I think recognizing that I did have an early start as a leader. I had my first board level role at 27, so I was pretty raw in lots of ways. And I remember, I think there's two categories. There's the sort of competitive stuff and how that affected me. And I think quite early on, I realized maybe not everybody is sees the world like I do. And I had a colleague who was in my team. I was very young. He was much older, much more experienced. And we were talking one day and he said to me, you're good at setting a good ambitious goal, and that's a good thing. And you also let us all know that you don't suffer fools gladly. And it was a backhanded compliment, and it really gave me pause for thought. And I thought, ooh, okay, what is it that I'm doing that is making people feel that I'm impatient, not as empathetic, not as understanding as I need to be? And I think, that definitely was an unintended consequence. And I really thought about it. And I thought, yeah, I do show that. I tap the table, I look away, I'm signaling with my body language, like, I've heard enough now, I've moved on. And that kind of, competitive thing of thinking, well, I'm focused on me, and how I've got this, I know what we're doing, and you just expect everybody else is like you. So I'm really grateful to him because he gave me the chance to think, ooh, what's that like to be on the receiving end of this? And how is it making people feel? And I wasn't an unpleasant person. I know my colleagues liked me, but clearly they felt a bit unnerved by if you're not keeping up, there's not much understanding here. So I really thought about it and tried to, correct my expression, my stopping the table tapping or looking away or anything like that. And just mentally tried to remind myself, put yourself in the shoes of the person opposite you and think that through. So that was really helpful. And then I think as time went on, as I got more seasoned and experienced the highs and lows, lots of, in any leader's life, you're going to encounter all things that derail. And that's when you really know how important it is that you've built a trusting environment and you've got a team of people who understand and empathize with you. So, going through some of those life experiences, especially my son's illness, and watching a lot of my colleagues go through really difficult experiences in their personal lives, I think just really helped me tap into how important it is to front up with compassion, with empathy, with understanding, with a listening ear, before you leap in with, I know the answer, or this is about me. So yeah, that in the early days was really helpful, I think, for me, course correcting with some of the stuff that wasn't nice for others. And then I was thinking about this in terms of the exposure to a lot of harassment and sexism and violence. There were 3 kind of pivotal experiences that, if we have time, I'll share with you. Sure. Okay. So the first one was at a tender stage. I was only 14. This was my hospital gift shop job, and we always worked in pairs. But when somebody had a meal break, we would be on our own in the shop. And one day I was on my own while my colleague was having a meal. And I remember this so vividly. I was only 14 and I'm not a giant. I'm only 5 foot tall. So I was very skinny. And this giant kind of came into the shop and he was weaving. He was, clearly really, really drunk. And he mumbled that he wanted to buy a flower. We had a display case outside the shop in the hospital lobby. So I toddled off with the key and opened the case, and he pointed to the one he wanted, which was like in a brandy glass. It was a rose. And staring at me, even though he was weaving because he was really drunk, he sort of brought the glass to his lips and drank the water in it and then started eating the flower. So it was quite an unnerving experience. And I think fortunately the reception desk was opposite and it was manned by somebody who was watching this unfold, and they called security. And while the security guys arrived and sort of helped him realize he probably would be better off not in the hospital, my colleague came back from her meal. I felt, I didn't feel like I was at risk, but it was a bit unnerving. But she went completely off the deep end, and she was a lot older. She was in her 30s and she had 2 young daughters, and she just would not stop. She launched a campaign all about how vulnerable we were and and we needed to have a panic button, and it was unacceptable for anybody to be left alone in the shop. And I'm saying this because I think it formulated an early view for me around, ooh, okay, I'm vulnerable because I'm female. I can't be on my own. I'm, subject to predators who want to interfere and hurt me in some way. And so I absorbed a lot of her anxiety, I guess, about what it meant to be a female, that you shouldn't, that you shouldn't, you're always at risk, and you shouldn't be on your own, and you're unsafe. So I know that sounds a bit weird, but anyway, that was one episode that I think was quite pivotal. And the second one was a few years later, when I went to Columbia as a new student. So for anybody who doesn't know, Columbia is in New York City. It's in Harlem on the Upper West Side. It's a lovely campus, but in the 80s, when I was a student there, it was really, really dangerous. Yeah. And while all of my peers from high school were having inductions about all the parties and the clubs and the sororities and fraternities, my induction was the safety briefing from a very gruff former New York Police Department detective who gave us a whole list of rules about, this is not a safe place. And if you are ever on public transport, you must never establish eye contact with anybody, never engage with anybody who's homeless or begging, because they're all, a risk and they're very dangerous. You must always carry pepper spray or mace with you. You should never be alone, especially not at night and in the dark. Make sure you've never had a drink when you're on your own. You can't take the subway beyond 96th Street if you're on the express train, because you'll end up in East Harlem, and immediately you get out the train, you will die. There were all sorts of really serious warnings. And the sad thing is that, like, I'm making a bit light of it now, but it was all true. And the message was, you're a target, you're a victim waiting to happen. There are all these predators around you, and you're not in a safe place. And more than that, it's your responsibility, to sort this out. Nobody else is going to come to your rescue. And unfortunately, on a daily basis, I would experience that low-level harassment. So walking on the campus or anywhere in the city, you'd get catcalls, you'd get people walking up to you, just saying totally inappropriate things because they could. And on the subway, if you had the misfortune of being on a subway train that was busy, people would press up against you and harass you. It was really unpleasant. And it got more serious. I mean, I had loads of classmates who were mugged and robbed. And unfortunately, quite a few experienced really horrible sexual violence. So there was a girl who lived on the floor above me who was raped in the dorm room in my first year. One of my roommate's friends was raped and sodomized when she'd gone for a jog in Riverside Park in the middle of the morning. Really horrible examples. So yeah, that was like something to absorb. And I think it formed a threshold for me about like expectation of, that's part of life, other harassment, that's just part of life. And I think it's quite a dangerous belief to bring in with you, but I unconsciously absorbed that. And then the final example that I had that I think was really formative for me was in one of my first jobs, in a professional role, I was appointed as a management consultant in a new firm. It was very small and part of a much larger group with a number of subsidiary companies. And I shared an office with a colleague, and we were initially next to another company, an investment company. And unfortunately, there was a guy who worked in there who was a lot older than me. And just from the off, he would follow me around whenever I was in the kitchen or the hallway or whatever. You'd just get all the inappropriate comments, the questions, the suggestions, loads of innuendo. And it made me really horribly uncomfortable. And one day, I didn't realize he was behind me as I walked into the office, and I got kind of pinned in the corner, and, all the questions, it was really horrible. And fortunately, my colleague came back into the office. And so the guy who was harassing me left, and he could see I was really shaken. And he said, are you okay? And I said, don't ever leave me alone in here with him again. And he said, okay. And we never spoke about it in any more detail. And I think back now and realize we'd both absorbed the culture of this place. You do not say anything. It was a very laddish kind of environment. And I knew, it didn't even occur to me to raise this with my boss or anybody else, because I knew it would be what was wrong with me. Couldn't I take a joke? Didn't I know that was banter? Wasn't I flattered to have the attention of somebody older and more senior, And I should say, I was the only woman in that whole group of companies that wasn't a secretary. So I knew it would be, this is what happens if you hire women. They're so emotional. They're so oversensitive. They can't function in a normal workplace. So it was really horrible. And I look back and think of the 25-year-old me, and I'm a bit disappointed that I just absorbed this and didn't challenge it. I understand why I didn't, but it's a shame. And so I think all of those were not great experiences in terms of recognizing that for a lot of people, there's a tolerance and a threshold of what you accept as normal, and also that sense of just not being empowered to deal with bad behavior. And I've gone on to address all of those, but those are my reflections of early career influences that weren't so good, that really held back me and held back my approach to leadership.
I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you. And there's some really interesting lessons there. And I hope you don't mind me asking this question, because it's a natural follow-on. So the decade after you were talking about those experiences, so maybe into your mid-late 30s, and you then wanted to start to put these things right, which I get completely. As you were doing that, depending on the environments you were working in, I'm guessing there were risks at that point that could also hold you back in terms of being the voice in the room, the one that speaks out, the one that... So could you expand upon that, how that affected you in terms of making that stand?
Yeah, I think I did sort of retreat back, and I didn't deal with it well. And then I was very fortunate to move on to other roles where it was a completely different environment, a lot more women in senior positions. So it wasn't necessarily a challenge to me day to day. And I've gone on, absolutely, as I've become more established and more senior myself, I have such an eye to this. And I have a daughter the same age as I was when I experienced all of this. And I was chatting with a friend of mine who said, oh, Annabelle would never put up with that. And I know she wouldn't, but we know it goes on, don't we?
Yeah,
so I think it's, only latterly that I've really connected to, needing to take a stand. And I definitely was held back and more in my shell. I think, I definitely worked hard on the improvement areas for my personal style. And in terms of, building on that, kind of creating a more inclusive environment, that was really what I tried to do. And I think, I can talk about that, how I've tried in later years, but I would say it held me back. Definitely. I wasn't very, despite being a really confident person, I was still really reluctant to challenge initially, the bad behavior of others and the cultural wrongs. Often what I would do, I've noticed, is remove myself. So if I saw something that really wasn't something I could live with or influence, I would just move on to another role.
Yeah, well,
rather than fixing it. Yeah.
And unfortunately, as you say, it's still a problem, and leaders around the world have this responsibility to remove toxicity from their cultures, and still it's not being done very well in most places. So let's move on. We're coming toward the last sort of 5 or so minutes of our time together, Sue, and I guess there are a couple of areas to explore. The first is, as you moved into your latter stages of your career, which you explained earlier in terms of what you've been doing and that responsibility and obviously chairing boards, etc. What is it there as you become more mature, more aware, we become more self-aware? What is it that you've still been working on, particularly in stakeholder engagement? Because that's something we've not talked about yet.
Yeah, definitely. So working on, lots of stuff. I think, generally that appreciation of that actually it's a real power to have difference and talent. So as I've got more senior, I've realized the biggest danger is in appointing a lot of mini-me's and a comfort zone. So what you really want to do is try to attract people who are much better than you are in lots of other areas, and then make sure that you're adapting the environment to take account of their abilities, their preferences for how they work. So I've noticed, particularly as a chair, you can spot the people who process immediately and who are just on the edge of their seat. They always want to put their hand up and chime in, or, they think by talking aloud. And then there's lots who sort of sit back and are much more reflective, and you don't hear from them because they're still thinking about the first item on the agenda as you're nearing the end of the meeting. So I think trying to build in, and pitch things in a way that creates an environment where all styles, all comers are kind of comfortable and feel encouraged to participate is really the useful lesson that I've learned. And I've come to think about leadership roles, and particularly being a chairman, as more akin to conducting the orchestra. So rather than being the lead violin or, the star piccolo player or something, you're really there with a strategic overview, and particularly in stakeholder management, that you're really conscious of the contribution that all of the different sections of your orchestra can make, and that your job is to convey what the common goal and the common purpose is, or the topic, and then to bring and facilitate people to come in at the right time in a way that creates that mutual respect and trust, listening to each other, so that you get a better outcome. You get the tuneful outcome, that rather than something really discordant. And I just think generally, having recognized, my core belief is that leadership is fantastic. It's such a rewarding, privileged opportunity, especially when you realize it's nothing to do with you. You don't need to, seek out approval or any rewards or notices. The biggest reward is in seeing other people passing the torch, seeing other people progress. And I am totally focused on that. I think that is the greatest reward. And when people know that actually you're there trying to help them grow and achieve their best and make their best contribution to the overall goal, then they trust you, and they repay that with lots of motivation, lots of effort, a great team spirit, a really good joke, that's the fun bit. And I think, I've focused on kind of being a really good role model, checking myself, making sure that I'm demonstrating the kind of behaviors that I would hope others, portray. Second, making sure I really showcase and call out the good practice and behaviors of others. So putting the spotlight on them it's great, to praise people in public, because it also reinforces, this is what we value here. This is how you get on. This is the sort of behavior and contribution that's recognized. And then third, just being uncompromising in challenging bad behavior and breaches of professional standards, code of conduct. And I, throughout my chairing career, have dealt with a lot of whistleblowings and protected disclosures. So that's when it gets really serious. But I think it's so important to signal as a leader that you are listening, that you are approachable. And I always say to people who bring concerns to me, I'm always here and willing to listen, but remember, I can't unhear anything that you tell me. So I'm telling you that if there's something that needs to be acted on, it's going to get dealt with. And I will tell you what the next steps are, but I'm not going to just walk away and say, oh, that's a shame, or that's too bad. So I think when people know that you've got a moral compass and some integrity, that definitely helps. And it does build confidence, I think, in all your stakeholders, not just your team and your employees, but your customers and people who are looking at you, have a stake in what you're doing.
I agree. And it's amazing for those that are moving into roles now, which are bigger roles. It's amazing, as you've experienced, how suddenly everything that you do or say or what you don't say is amplified. It's fascinating. So I've got one last question for you, Sue, which is a two-part question. So you'll get a two-part question. So we're both best-selling authors. Lovely to hear about your book in terms of firecracker leadership. So I want to understand firstly, we all have this book in us, every single human being on the planet.
Yes.
What was it for you that made it stir within you and come to the surface for you to create that? And secondly, tied to that, what kind of legacy are you hoping to leave behind?
Okay, yeah, definitely. I was one of those who carried my book around mentally in my head for probably decades. And I think it was having the catalyst was really ending my term at Liverpool University Hospitals and having the luxury of thinking, what next? And finally being able to prioritize sitting down and getting what was in my head out onto my fingertips, onto a keyboard and putting that together. And what really drove me, I think, was that sense, especially coming out of the pandemic and having led one of the largest trusts in a really deprived area that was so badly affected. I thought I've had a lot of experience here that could be useful for others. And if I could find a way to distill all I'd learned in a structured way, but in a really, I hope, engaging way, because it's very story-based, then hopefully that could be of benefit to somebody else. So that was really my driving force. And yeah, it's so nice, isn't it, Andrew, when you finally get your book published and somebody says something nice about it and they tell you that it's helped them. It just feels fantastic, doesn't it? So it's really rewarding.
And the legacy, what are you hoping to leave behind after you've gone, hopefully many years from now, still many years from now? What is it that you're hoping to leave behind?
Yeah, so I guess, we started talking about the difficult year I'd had with the passing of some loved ones, and that does bring into sharp focus the whole legacy question. And I had a big birthday last month, and my kids put together a book for me of contributions from school friends, relatives, early colleagues, most recent colleagues. And that was amazing. It was so touching and lovely to read it. So I think the legacy apparently that I'm on track for leaving is on the good side, a warm, generous, really caring, loving person who also loves a good laugh and has given people permission to find work to be fun and to just be helpless with laughter. So I think, I think that's some of the things that I'm told I'm on track for based on the past. And I really hope that I can pass the torch and inspire some confidence and self-belief in leaders to come, because I just see so many people with amazing talent who feel crippled by imposter syndrome and lack of self-belief and don't see what I see in them. So that's what I would really love to be able to unlock. And, last week I was doing a webinar and I didn't realize that a former colleague from the Liverpool Hospital was on the call, and she'd posted a really nice comment in the chat during the webinar. And when I thanked her privately, she said, I really, treasure the time that I worked under your leadership. And I always felt extra safe. And I thought, wow, I'll take that. That's fantastic. So yeah, that's what I would hope for.
Lovely, Sue. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your journey with us today. It's been fascinating to hear about the richness early in your life, how that then obviously grew into these experiences you gained. Obviously, we weren't necessarily positive, but you turned them into a positive, how you then led your leadership style, and then more latterly in terms of the way that you've managed through the pandemic as well. So thanks again, Sue, for being on the show. I've really enjoyed meeting you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader. You can access all previous episodes of the show at confessionsofaSuccessfulLeader.com. If you are interested in finding out more about conscious leadership and self-coaching, just type in Andrew Tallents into LinkedIn or your favorite browser, and you'll find my contact details and all the content that you need. Until next time, don't forget to stay present, curious, and above all, conscious.